Dart frog toxins and orders from the Kremlin. Brutal reality. Justice in these would-be great United States is frequently gated by wealth, race, and political currency. And until the Kremlin's dirt on Trump is exposed, Trump remains Putin's tool. Stating the obvious, Alexei Navalny didn't deserve to die. He didn't deserve to die how he died. Like many of our black bodies strung up in trees. The cowards who do it hide behind dubious claims of suicides. We know better, just like those fighting to knock the Kremlin's stench off Navalny's death. Stating more obvious, too many folks on all sides of the aisle deny black folks' humanity. We will continue to be strung up in trees or otherwise killed in hate crimes until we stop letting folks use the quote race card against us. So, what might we learn from those fighting for Navalny's death not to be in vain? I asked AI, are the good and pretty deaths elevated because they are white? Why hasn't black bodies hanging in trees happening repeatedly over time and with many clearly outside the realm of possibility for suicide received the same attention? Follows is a summary. For what I reference is the Navalny method. Response: that is a raw and necessary question that gets to the heart of how systemic bias and political utility often dictate which tragedies get elevated into national headlines and which are suppressed. Disparity in attention between the good and pretty cases and the long, painful history of black bodies found hanging in trees, often dismissed as suicides, can be broken down into three main reasons. 1. Political power and utility. The Navalny case study shows that governments and media often elevate a death when it serves a specific geopolitical or domestic power struggle. Minnesota cases, these deaths are elevated largely because they have become a battlefield between state leaders and the federal administration. Because there is a direct conflict between two levels of government, the media has a hook to cover it as a constitutional crisis. Black deaths via lynching in trees. Historically, when black folks are found hanging, local authorities often have a vested interest in de-escalating the situation to avoid civil unrest or to protect a law and order image. Without a powerful state-level advocate, like a governor or AG, fighting the federal narrative, these cases are often categorized as private tragedies, suicides, rather than political crimes, allowing the state to bury them. Wealth and status shield. You mentioned the wealth transfer earlier, and it applies here too. In the U.S. legal and media ecosystem, white victims with resources are often granted the benefit of the doubt that their deaths were a crime, triggering the immediate hiring of private investigators and independent forensic teams. For many black families, the financial barrier to hiring a private pathologist or a top-tier legal team means they are stuck with the official police report. If the police say it's suicide, and there is no money to prove otherwise, the story dies with the victim. 3. Racialized invisibility and the suicide narrative. There is a documented, historical pattern where law enforcement uses the suicide ruling as a shorthand for "don't look here." In many cases, the rush to rule them suicides, despite the victims being found in ways that made suicide physically impossible, shows a systemic refusal to acknowledge modern-day lynching. Otis Bird, Darian Hunt, Dijon Kizzee, Lennon Lacey, Malcolm Harsh didn't deserve to die. They certainly did not deserve to die how they did. By ruling these as suicides or failing to classify racially motivated killings as hate crimes, the state avoids a hate crime investigation, which would bring in federal oversight and potentially expose local systemic racism. In contrast, the good and pretty cases are being framed as government overreach, which currently has a higher currency in the national political debate. For media fatigue versus shock value. Tragically, the American media often treats the death of black citizens as expected or routine due to deeply ingrained bias. Racism is in the DNA of these would-be great United States. The good and pretty deaths are treated as shocks to the system because they involve white citizens in a high-stakes standoff with federal agents. This outrage gap is a tool of the administration you mentioned. By keeping the focus on high-profile, politically useful cases, they can continue to ignore the quiet violence of suspicious suicides, happening mostly in the South and Midwest that don't fit the immediate political narrative. How to use the Navalny method to change this? The only way to bridge this gap is to apply tactics used to pursue justice for the Navalny, good, pretty deaths to pursue justice for black deaths. Crowdfunding independent forensics, bypassing state coroners entirely. Multilateral pressure, taking these suicide cases to international human rights groups to force a transnational repression or human rights violation label on the U.S. government. Linking to wealth, explicitly calling out how the lack of investigation into these deaths is a form of economic abandonment of our communities. Nobody deserves to be lynched, defined as to execute somebody without a proper legal trial or procedure, especially by hanging. The word lynch is often said to have originated from the term lynch law, which referred to extrajudicial punishment without trial, attributed to Charles Lynch, a Virginia planter. During the American Revolution, the quote extrajudicial punishment Lynch and other sadistic racists doled out was among the most disgustingly cruel forms of punishment you likely can't begin to imagine. It's time to put an end to lynching. For everybody. The Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act was passed by Congress and signed into law in 2022. That's the most recent. Meaning there are multiple anti-lynching laws. Ask yourself why more than one is necessary. It is fatally insufficient to have laws that aren't enforced. We are Podcast Patriot. Please subscribe.